Okay, today we're going to go over archetypes and their role in fantasy. Okay, picture this. Once upon a time, a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Does this sound at all familiar to you? If it does, you're probably remembering the basic plot of many epic fantasies, such as Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, but also older ones like the Odyssey and Beowulf. This basic structure is called a monomyth, which is defined as a cyclical journey or quest taken by a mythical hero. Within the monomyth, you'll find some common archetypes that help move the plot along. Archetype can mean several things, such as a very typical example of a person or thing, or an original that has been imitated. In this context, however, we'll be focusing on a recurrent symbol or motif in literature, art, or mythology. In this presentation, we will be going over the history of the archetype, adaptations of the archetype, the hero's journey, how to put it all together, and some examples in modern films. All right, let's get started. Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist who founded what we know as analytical psychology. His work was hugely influential on psychiatry in general, but we're going to focus on his work on archetypes. Jung noticed recurring patterns in his work with patients that persisted through all cultures and human development. Using his experiences, he introduced our first understanding of archetypes, which he based on Kant's categories, Plato's ideas, and Schopenhauer's prototypes. He called these primordial images, a term here that means existing at or from the beginning of time. These primordial images, or archetypes as they came to be called, are deep patterns in the human psyche that remain present over time. The root of an archetype is in the collective unconscious of mankind, or experiences shared by a race or culture such as life, death, birth, love, religion, survival, and struggle. Jung realized that these exist in the subconscious of every individual, and he found these in patients' dreams, as well as art, literature, and sacred myths. He then used these to develop treatment strategies. He went on to list various archetypal events, figures, and motifs. You might recognize many of these from various myths or sacred writings like God, Devil, Wise Old Man, the Creation, the Flood, which has appeared all over the place in ancient texts. Jung eventually narrowed things down to what he called the four most prominent archetypes of the human psyche: the persona, the self, the shadow, and the anima or animus. The persona is also called the mask and is how we present ourselves to the world. The self is the unified consciousness and unconsciousness of an individual. The shadow is one's dark side, those aspects of oneself that exist but which one doesn't acknowledge or identify with. And the anima is man's primordial image of woman and vice versa. It's the feminine qualities in men and the masculine in women. Altogether, there are really infinite archetypes, and many of them exist within us, and characters, simultaneously. That's how strong characters come to life. Carol Pearson and Margaret Mark are two individuals who answered a very important question many have asked throughout history. How can I use this to make a profit? They came out with a hugely successful book called The Hero and the Outlaw, which takes Jungian archetypes and categorizes them for use in branding and marketing. They attributed 12 different archetypes to Jung and organized them into 3 overarching categories based on a fundamental driving force. In other words, what makes a consumer want to buy something? These are the ego types, the soul types, and the self types. For the ego types, we have the innocent, the orphan / every person, the hero, and the caregiver. For the soul types, we have the explorer, the rebel, the lover, and the creator. Lastly, for the self types, we have the jester, the sage, the magician, and the ruler. In this image here, you can see how these have been applied to various companies that should be familiar to you. And guess what? It works. Think of a Rolex and you picture a wealthy and successful businessman on top of the world appealing to ruler types. And how many commercials have there been for Dove in which we see a little baby being gently washed with soap and water? That's zeroing in on the innocent ideal of the consumer. I'll let you look at this for another second before we move on. I'll also take this time to say, feel free to ask any questions you want and we'll address them at the end of this presentation. Joseph Campbell. He took the idea of archetypes and combined them with patterns he saw in art, literature, mythology. He noticed that the stories that were most well-known or impactful followed a similar path and featured similar types of characters. Eventually, he came out with the influential book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which introduces the concept of the hero's journey, also known as the monomyth. In fact, Campbell's work was so influential it inspired George Lucas, who used it to construct the plot, characters, and themes for a movie idea of his. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called Star Wars. Campbell's monomyth consists of 17 steps, split into 3 stages: the departure, the initiation, and the return. There's a lot to unpack there, but basically, the hero's journey ends up looking like this. It becomes a big circle, and indeed the monomyth is looked at as a cyclical journey, as the hero literally comes full circle. Christopher Vogler. He eventually took Campbell's idea and condensed it, making it more palatable for writing with the writer's journey. In this version of the hero's journey, there are 12 steps. Heroes are introduced in the ordinary world where they receive the call to adventure. They are reluctant at first or refuse the call, but are encouraged by a mentor to cross the first threshold and enter the special world. They encounter tests, allies, and enemies. They approach the inmost cave, crossing a second threshold, where they endure the ordeal. They take possession of their reward. They encounter challenges on the road back to the ordinary world. They cross a third threshold, experience a resurrection, and are transformed by the experience. They return with the elixir, which is a boon or a treasure to benefit the ordinary world. Vogler argued that archetypes, commonly used to describe characters' personalities, should instead be used to describe influential forces within a narrative. Therefore, he decided on 8 archetypes: the hero, the herald, the mentor, the threshold guardian, the ally or allies, the trickster, the shapeshifter, and the shadow. The hero is your main character, and this is their journey. The herald comes in to introduce the hero to the special world. This can be a character like R2-D2 relaying Princess Leia's message to Obi-Wan, or an object like Dumbledore's letters inviting Harry Potter to Hogwarts. The mentor is a character who guides the hero in some way. That is usually an older character due to the wisdom they impart. Haymitch from the Hunger Games is a mentor. The threshold guardian exists to challenge the hero, who must overcome this to progress into the special world. Fluffy, the 3-headed dog from Harry Potter, is a threshold guardian. But it could also be an inner battle the hero must come to terms with, like Alice, who decides to follow the white rabbit down the rabbit hole. The ally or allies come into contact with the hero and help with their journey. This character can be many different things, even an animal like Dorothy's dog Toto from The Wizard of Oz. The trickster's main purpose is to create change, its lesser purpose being comic relief. Merry and Pippin from The Lord of the Rings are tricksters who serve as comic relief and also push the plot forward. The shapeshifter is a character who is a shaky ally of the hero. They're working with the hero in some capacity, but usually for their own goals. Snape in the Harry Potter books is a shapeshifter. We don't even know where his loyalties lie until book 7. And lastly, the shadow is most often what you'd think of when you think of a villain of the story, and they tend to have the greatest presence during the climax. Like Jung's shadow archetype from earlier in this presentation, this character presents what could happen if the hero goes down a dark path or falls victim to some sort of corruption. Okay, so we've gone over the monomyth and the archetypes, but how do we put it all together? How do we actually lay down the foundation of a great fantasy story? Using all of the information so far, here's a visual representation of the hero's journey, the character arc of the hero, the pacing of the story, and the archetypes found there. Alright, let's start with the hero's journey. We've got 3 acts and the 12 steps about where they occur in the story. At each step, there's a corresponding character arc, because the point of the steps is to push the story forward and change the hero. With it laid out like this, you can actually see where big chunks of the story happen and how we get to that point. The plot ends up looking like this. This is called The arc plot. We have the exposition or setup, rising action, climax, falling action, and the denouement, which is French for untie. You are literally untangling knots and resolving loose ends. There are 5 major turning points with 6 stages in the story. Each stage's content is built around leading the hero to the next turning point. Visualizing the plot here, the first 4 archetypes are normally found in Act 1, them being the hero, the herald, the mentor, and the threshold guardian, who signals the hero moving from the ordinary world to the special world where most of the story takes place. Then the hero meets allies, tricksters, and shapeshifters. Towards the middle of this act, the hero will often encounter another threshold guardian, who can also act as the crisis the hero deals with at this point in the story. Moving into Act 3, the hero is rewarded in some way after the crisis, but it's often a Pyrrhic victory, which means a victory won at great cost, sometimes too great. Therefore, several characters may exit the story here, due to deaths or simply parting ways. Finally, towards the climax, the hero has to deal with the shadow. If we look closer at one of the archetypes, like the threshold guardian, you will find that sometimes they can turn into an ally, like in Robin Hood, when he beats Little John, who is barring his passage, and turns him into a friend. In a more sinister turn, an ally can also turn into the shadow, like in Zootopia. Assistant Mayor Bellwether goes from helping the hero throughout the story to ultimately showing the extremes prey animals in this universe could go to in positions of power, which is something Judy Hopps must confront. Loki, from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, appears as at least 4 different archetypes and goes back and forth between them. Thor's shadow, a shapeshifter who could just as easily stab Thor in the back as help him, a trickster dealing in schemes that cause trouble and funny moments, and an ally who helps not only Thor but also the rest of the Avengers now and then. The point is, archetypes are not cemented. They can emerge as another and then even switch back. A good character will contain several archetypes, just as we as people act as different archetypes to ourselves and others. This creates depth. Let's take a look at all of this in action. First we have Star Wars: A New Hope. Luke Skywalker lives on Tatooine with his aunt and uncle, who are moisture farmers. Luke discovers that one of his new droids is carrying a message from Princess Leia, looking for Obi-Wan Kenobi. Luke has too much to do at the farm and can't go on adventures. Luke meets Obi-Wan, who tells him of the Force. Luke and Obi-Wan find out that Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru have been murdered by stormtroopers looking for the droid's message. Luke has nothing left for him on Tatooine, and he and Obi-Wan depart. They manage to get past stormtroopers barring their entrance to Mos Eisley. Luke and Obi-Wan meet Han Solo and Chewbacca, and by passage on the Millennium Falcon. The group arrives at the Death Star. The group struggles to infiltrate the Death Star, and Obi-Wan encounters Darth Vader. Luke finds Princess Leia. Obi-Wan has been killed by Darth Vader. Luke and his allies regroup and discuss how to destroy the Death Star. Luke volunteers to be a pilot on a dangerous mission to destroy the Death Star. He is able to use the Force to hit his target and win the day for the Rebel Alliance. Luke and his friends are given awards for their bravery, but the Empire is not yet defeated. Next up, we have Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Harry Potter lives with his aunt, uncle, and cousin on Privet Drive. His world consists of his relatives and the tiny cupboard that serves as his bedroom. Mysterious letters begin arriving addressed to Harry, to his exact location, as if the house is being watched. Harry's relatives seize every letter and do not let Harry read them. Excuse me. Eventually, Uncle Vernon takes the family to a remote location to avoid the letters, which keep coming and in greater numbers. Hagrid, keeper of the keys and grounds at Hogwarts, arrives and Harry finally reads his letter. Hagrid answers Harry's questions. The Dursleys refuse to let Harry go to Hogwarts. Hagrid casts a spell on Dudley, their son, and they scurry away in fear, leaving Harry able to move on. He eventually boards the Hogwarts Express via platform 9 3/4, leaving the Muggle world behind. Harry faces his first test at the sorting ceremony and chooses to align himself with the House Gryffindor, even though the Sorting Hat said he could rise to greatness through Slytherin. This choice immediately determines Harry's allies and enemies within Hogwarts walls and beyond. Harry and his friends Hermione and Ron decide to go on their first magical adventure together to keep Professor Snape, who they are convinced has nefarious intentions, from stealing the Sorcerer's Stone. Harry, Hermione, and Ron overcome the numerous magical obstacles blocking them from retrieving the Sorcerer's Stone, but narrowly. From a three-headed dog to murderous Flora, the trio faces death at every turn along the way. Harry, Ron, and Hermione participate in a wizard chess battle to continue on their way, and they finally win. However, Ron had to sacrifice himself to do so and is injured. Hermione stays with him, and Harry moves on alone. Harry dashes into the last chamber just in time to battle for the stone. He encounters Professor Quirrell and discovers that Lord Voldemort has possessed the professor's body in an attempt to steal the stone and kill Harry. Using Quirrell's body, Voldemort fights Harry for the stone, and while he does not succeed, Quirrell's body is destroyed, and Harry nearly dies in the struggle. Harry wakes up in the hospital days later, where Dumbledore tells Harry more about his parents and answers some of his questions. Harry and his friends are publicly recognized by Professor Dumbledore and subsequently awarded house points for bravery. The semester ends, and he returns to the Muggle world, armed with the support and love from the wizarding world he now calls home. Lastly, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Frodo is a hobbit who lives in the Shire. He lives with his uncle Bilbo, who departs the Shire suddenly and leaves Frodo his house and all his possessions, including a magical ring. Gandalf appears with grave news about the ring and urges Frodo to set out on a quest to destroy the ring. Frodo, terrified, tries to give the ring to Gandalf, who refuses. Though reluctant to leave his comfortable life in the Shire, he and his friend Samwise set off, aiming to later meet Gandalf at the border. They are joined by Merry and Pippin on their journey and eventually make their way to a village. Gandalf is nowhere to be found, and a man known as Strider takes them under his wing, who knows about the ring and the dangerous enemies closing in on the party. They encounter the ring wraiths on the way to Rivendell, and Frodo is gravely injured. Aided by an elf named Arwen, he is whisked away and must get to Rivendell before he turns into a ring wraith himself. They arrive just in time. Frodo is brought back to health, and a grand meeting is held to discuss what to do with the ring. Frodo volunteers to take the ring to Mordor. Others volunteer as well. His hobbit friends, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, Gandalf, Strider, who turns out to be Aragorn, heir to the throne of Gondor, Legolas the elf, Gimli the dwarf, and Boromir, who seems to want the ring a little too much. The Fellowship travels a long way and encounters many difficulties, leading them to take a more dangerous path through the mines of Moria. They manage to enter Moria, but an encounter with a monster traps them inside. They carefully make their way through the mines. Goblins are alerted to their presence, and an intense battle takes place. They desperately try to make it to the exit of Moria, but are thwarted by a Balrog. Gandalf faces off against the Balrog, and it falls down into the abyss, but takes the wizard with him. The rest of the Fellowship is able to leave the mines and continue on their journey. After being granted boons by the elves of Lothlorien, the Fellowship makes their way towards Mordor, but enemies begin to close in on them again. The group clashes with an army of Uruk-hai, who have been sent by Saruman to seize the ring-bearer. Frodo realizes he must sneak away from the Fellowship and continue on alone, but he is accosted by a corrupted Boromir, who tries to take the ring from him. Frodo escapes. Boromir, himself again, defends the hobbits, and dies in the process. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli regroup and decide to go rescue Merry and Pippin. Sam finds Frodo, and the two set off for Mordor together. And there you have it. You can recognize archetypes now in the world around you, and you know the most basic fantasy plot and how it plays out. That's all the groundwork you need to get started. The rest is up to you to imagine your story. I hope you enjoyed this program, and I'll leave you with this wonderful quote. We have not even to risk the adventure alone. For the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is fully known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path. And where we had thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. Where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outward, we shall come to the center of our own existence. Where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world. Joseph Campbell. And that's it. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Does anyone have any questions for me? Looks like we have no unanswered questions, so I guess I bombarded you guys with enough information to...
Well, while they think, I can show what the prize is if you'd like.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm gonna let Jeremy take my place here. All right.